There are two CSS properties that allow us to create animation within our web pages. They are the animation property, in which we define keyframes for our animation, and the transition property, in which we define the animation or transition between two different states of an element. In this video, I'll explore the transition property, which is easy to implement and really useful. It starts by having a state change on an element, such as the hover pseudo class that I have on this section. You'll see in my code here that I simply have a section, and I've already defined some CSS to center that and give it a background color and a size. And when I hover over it, which is basically like mouse over, right, we get this transition that happens, but that transition is sudden. It doesn't actually transition, it pops. And so some simple CSS that we could add would simply be the transition property to say, hey, if this element ever changes, we want to animate that change. And the easiest way to implement that is to say that I want to animate it on all elements and that I want it to take a certain amount of time, let's say 1 second. That's all I'd have to add here. If I hit save and take a look at this now, when I roll over, that transition is gradual. It takes 1 second. On all of the different properties here, including the border radius, the width, the background, and the text color, all transition or animate into place. What could be easier? A simple line of code saying what we want to transition and how long we want it to take. So if you didn't want to transition all the properties though, we could specify particular properties. Let's say all we wanted to animate was the width property. I could just define the width. That's going to take 1 second. And if we take a look at this now, everything else is going to pop except for the width is the one that's going to animate. So we can do this on individual properties if we want, or we could assign it to do it on all the properties, which is typically what you'll want. And of course, I got to spell that right. All right, so what we're looking at here is shorthand for really 4 basic properties that you can assign related to transition. And so those properties include the property that you want to transition. So I'm going to take a look at this, right? So we've basically got the property that we want, how long we want, and that's all I'm saying here. I'm saying all properties and what the animation duration might be. Then we could add a timing function. Should it ease in or ease out or be a linear animation? We can also add a delay, which would not start the animation for example, a moment or a beat if you wanted. So that might be useful, for example, if you're doing a hover effect on something and it's supposed to have a drop menu. You might want that drop menu not to just pop out, you might want it to come out on a very slight delay. And so you could add that delay. Let's briefly look at these properties and define them independently, because you don't necessarily have to use the shorthand version. So the first one here is the transition property that you'd want. So I'm going to say that I want the transition property here, in this case, to be all. And that means that every property will transition. Then I could define a duration. So that would be my transition duration property. And I can do this in milliseconds or seconds. So if I wanted it to be a little quicker, I could say 500 milliseconds, for example. The next thing is the transition timing function. So that transition timing function by default would be an ease, but we could have this, start fast and slow down, ease out, or start slow and speed up with an ease in. Or we could just do a linear transition. And so we'll take a look at the timing function in more detail in a future video. Anyway, the last one would be the delay. And so I could go on here and add a transition delay. And let's say I don't want the whole thing to happen for a whole second. When I've added these 4 properties and I take a look at the effect, once I roll over here, you'll see that there's a 1 second delay. And then once that 1 second is over, I got a 500 millisecond transition for all of the properties. The same thing happens when I roll back off. We'll get a transition delay on roll off, and then it will return. Typically, I don't like that delay on most elements, so I won't have a transition delay. And if you don't apply it, the default is not to have it. All of these properties can be written in a single shorthand. So if I just use the word transition here, then I could say all properties 500 milliseconds. I want an ease, and I want, let's say, a very slight delay. I'm going to say 50 milliseconds. If I apply all of those there, I can have a very slight delay, but I still get a transition. But if I just roll across that, you'll see that it doesn't trigger it because there's a delay there. And so sometimes just allowing a tiny bit of delay allows users to sort of move across the interface without necessarily triggering the rollovers until they're actually on an element. Sometimes you don't want to transition all your elements, which is typically what I'll do here, but maybe I want the color, for example, of the type to pop, whereas the rest of the things will transition. To do that, I could string this, and instead of saying that I wanted to transition all, I could comment that out, and I could say which things I want to transition. So I can be specific that I want to transition the width, and I want that to take, let's say, 500 milliseconds. Then I want to maybe transition the border radius next. And what I do is I would make a comma there, and I could say, now I also want to do the border radius. And that would be the next element I want to transition. And I could actually make the border radius transition, for example, at a slower speed, let's say 1 second. I've only defined 2 transition elements here, and if we roll over, you'll see that the color elements pop, but the transitions of the width and the radius are actually going at different speeds here. And so we can just string together our list. So let's say I wanted the background color to also animate, and so I'm going to say background, and I want that to go pretty fast, let's say 500 milliseconds, and I'm going to make the border radius go really slow, 3 seconds. Each of these could be defined separately by putting a comma separated list here, and each property that I want to define could have different delays, different easing functions, and different durations. So when I roll over them here now, you'll see that the border radius takes a lot longer to actually come into place. The color of the type happens immediately. It immediately turns white, right? So we can define individual properties that we want to change. Transition is really powerful. I encourage you to explore it. It's quite a bit of fun.